Today we're going to be talking about NES games that are better than their arcade counterparts. So let's just start with the obvious one. The Ninja Gaiden arcade game was a generic beat-em-up with boring opponents and wimpy combat. There was just no oomph to the punches of that game. As a kid I enjoyed it, but as a kid I also enjoyed E.T. on the Atari 2600, so I don't know what that says about my taste. I remember bringing the NES game home after a family vacation. I was so excited to play it. When I initially turned it on, I didn't know what was going on. This is not the arcade game that I loved. Instead, there was this opening cutscene, which I'd never seen anything quite like, and it really did a good job of hooking you into the story, making you want to know what happens next. Then you are thrust into the action. This was not some generic beat-em-up like the arcade. This was something different. It was super fast platforming. Almost every enemy died in one hit, making you feel like a total badass as you cut through the enemies. Then you could stick to walls. That was crazy. At that point in my life, I had never seen a video game character stick to a wall. As the game progressed, it just got more and more insane. The story unfolded with all sorts of twists, turns, and crazy characters. The level design got insanely difficult very fast, and there were all sorts of cool sub-weapons to discover. Did I mention the difficulty? This game was insane, and unlike many games in that era, there were no cheat codes to make it through. You just had to get good. Quite a task for an 8-year-old kid to take on, but I did, and this game's insane blend of action, platforming, and awesome storytelling set it far above its arcade inspiration, and it's probably the first game you thought of when you saw the title of this video. The arcade version of Rygar is pretty cool. It is very fast-paced, lots of action, lots of enemies to smash, but pretty straightforward. It introduced us to the disc armor, which is just such a cool weapon, but the gameplay is pretty standard action platforming. Nothing really to make it stand out. It's a solid game, but nothing compared to the incredible home board that we got. Rygar was one of those mystical games of my childhood. I never owned it, nor did I ever rent it. There was an elderly woman who lived across the street from me. I would go to her house and play Nintendo with her, and Rygar was one of those games she owned. It was so much more than the arcade game. It was an absolutely epic quest, filled with a leveling system, a whole world to explore, items to collect, and mysteries to uncover. This was a game I didn't complete until I was an adult, but it was always one that I enjoyed playing. The world building here is fantastic, as are the controls and the combat. There was just so much to figure out and so much to see. When I started college, I got a job at Funkoland and started collecting for the NES. This is one of the first games I bought, and I went home and finally really played through it. Playing through this whole game really was quite the journey. It was just so elaborate. The world was really big, the levels were fantastic, and although it was difficult, you have unlimited continues, and you could level up to make things a little easier if you don't mind a little grinding. This is definitely a game that should have had a password or a save feature, but that aside, this is such an awesome adventure, and so much more than the linear action of the arcade game. The first time I saw Punch-Out in the arcades, I was blown away. The arcade setup had a cool 2-monitor system and some stereo sound where an announcer called all of your punches as you made them. It was one of the first games I would always visit when I went into an arcade, but playing it as an adult is just really underwhelming. The boxes are just kinda meh, the controls stiff, nothing is as responsive as you want it to be, and most of the enemy patterns are not really that interesting once you learn the game. The same cannot be said for the NES port. I will always say that Punch-Out is one of, if not, the most graphically impressive NES game ever made. They really worked magic with their hardware to create these fighters, which were just so lifelike and had personality like nothing else on the system. Graphics aside though, the NES port just plays so much better than its arcade counterpart. The roster of fighters was expanded, the control is super responsive, the enemy patterns are far more interesting, and it's just so satisfying to punch these enemies in the face. There was also a puzzle element to the game that was so much fun to uncover at the time. I've been playing this game my whole life, and if you ever watch me play through Punch-Out, I'm basically on autopilot. I don't have to really concentrate on Get to Tyson, I can just breeze through the rest of the game from sheer muscle memory alone. But as a kid, the first time you fought King Hippo, what are you supposed to do? It was the conversation on the school bus, on the playground. How do you hit King Hippo? What do you do when Great Tiger teleports? Did you know you could just alternate punches and one-shot Don Flamenco? These conversations were had all through recess as we all collectively tried to figure this game out in a time before the internet existed. But even after those mysteries were unlocked, this game is still just so much fun to play. It just has such a nice rhythm and pace to it, and people are still figuring out new ways to speedrun it. I really did love the arcade game as a kid, but the NES counterpart is just so much better. The arcade version of Double Dragon 2 is pretty good. It was like an expansion pack to the first Double Dragon. As a result, the graphics were extremely similar, and it felt kind of the same even though it had a totally different control layout. The intro to this game was nuts. Willie just walks up and shoots Marion on the streets. That was insane. The game was solid, but not totally spectacular. Then we got the home port, and this game just completely rocked. The story was a little more fleshed out with some cutscenes, but the gameplay here was just spectacular. It stuck to the formula of the arcade, where your attack buttons changed depending on the direction you faced. This was such a cool idea, and I'm surprised it isn't used more, especially now that we have so many more buttons. It made it really easy to hit enemies on all sides, but they expanded the moveset as well. You have the spin kick just like the arcade, but the home console version was just nuts and so much more powerful. And you also have these moves you could do when either recovering from a jump or the ground. The most famous, of course, being the knee smash. This thing was nuts. It was accompanied by an awesome sound effect, and when you hit these enemies, they just went flying. I don't think I've ever seen enemies fly so hard or so fast in any video game at that time. It really made the knee feel extremely powerful. The level design here was top-notch and greatly improved from its arcade counterpart. There was some platforming and some really tricky platforming at the end, but then you get these really cool set pieces, like a helicopter flying at you and shooting you. You dodge some bullets, beat up some enemies, and before you know it, you board the helicopter. Now you're fighting enemies in the helicopter. The door opens up sporadically, sucking you both out. You can use this to your advantage, and it is so incredibly satisfying to watch the enemies just get sucked out into their death. Every level has something cool going for it, and between the unique level design and expanded combat, this game is head and shoulders above its arcade counterpart. It was also extremely challenging. I know it has become common parlance to say that Double Dragon 3 is the hardest game in the NES trilogy, but this game, in my view, is just so much harder. But it's still just a fantastic game and one of the best beat-em-ups ever made to this day. I think every game on this list is not debatable. If you disagree, feel free to let me know in the comments, but I don't think anyone will really argue with my choices, except maybe this one. Even I'm kind of on the fence about it. The arcade version of Astyanax is a really fun, fast-paced action platformer that feels a lot like the legendary Axe on TurboGrafx 16. It has beautiful sprite work, blazing fast action, and its difficulty is actually pretty balanced for an arcade game. It's a game I really enjoy, but the home port just edges it out a little bit for me, and it could be due to nostalgia, so if I'm wrong, please let me know. Astyanax is one of those games I rented as a kid, and I loved it so much I just had to own it. The graphics here, I think, are just spectacular for an NES game. Your character is so large, as are most of the enemies. The bosses are really large and detailed too, usually taking up the whole screen. You fight them in black backgrounds, so the NES can just focus on making the boss look as impressive as possible, and these beasts are extremely impressive. The story here is much more fleshed out, and told with Ninja Gaiden-style cutscenes. Gameplay has the same premise as the arcade. You get weapons, and the longer you don't use them, the more powerful the swing you could unleash, represented by a meter at the bottom of the screen. You also get magic spells and upgrade your weapons through a variety of different ways. Gameplay here is not quite as fast as the arcade game. It's a little slower, with lots of cool large enemies to fight and solid level design. I don't think it's that hard of a game, but it is really fun. The large sprite work really sets it apart from most other NES games. It's one of my personal favorites on the system, and although I do really enjoy the arcade game, I still give the nod to the home port.